my dudes out? What's happening, man? This is Trent. Now, before I get started this week, I want to remind you that I'm running a big winter sale. That's 30% off of everything on my Gumroad channel. That's everything from beginner tutorials on art all the way up to the professional AAA game development tutorials on environment concept art and skin design. That's right. It's all on sale for 30% off. Get that code. Today, I want to talk a little bit about comic books. Specifically, I mean, things that I really enjoyed about doing comic books back in the day. And I didn't expect this. I had a lot of pain associated with working in comics. As an artist, as a writer, as a creative, there are a lot of things that are pretty damn cool about owning your own IP and making your own stories. Especially during COVID, there are a lot of people that are making their own comic. They're finally making their comic book dreams come true. All this comes up because a lot of people have been demanding that I return to comics. It's been like 27 years since I created a little indie comic called Creed. So I'm remastering a big collection. I'm sure I've announced it by now, but if you don't know, I'm remastering the Creed Imaginary Collection. This is like coming out to be like 90 some pages. The final book is over 100 pages and it's going to be coming to Indiegogo in January. So stay tuned to get more info on that. Oh yeah. So what you're seeing me work on right now is exactly that. This is me remastering some of those old pages that I was drawing while I was working in video games. Don't do that, by the way. It's insane. They're both extremely demanding things to be making, a video game and a comic. Whoo boy. This particular page is a new page. Yeah, that's right. I'm like adding a bunch of new scenes. So you get to see me do the whole process of penciling out pages and like taking it all the way to inks. So my first big successful indie comic came out when I was 16 years old. That's right. I was running my own company when I was 16 in a sense, because I was hiring my own colorists, my own letterers. I was writing the script. I was creating IPs that were being licensed. Yes, that's right. Creed was licensed to be an action figure. It was licensed to be a trading card series, and we even had an animation deal in the works, but it never really quite panned out. There's no like Creed film, footage somewhere that you don't know about. If there is, then I don't know about it. So when you're making a comic book, you're responsible for everything. It's usually a small operation. I did it pretty much solo for a long period of time, but it is helpful when you start to bring on like an inker and you start to bring on a colorist, and usually you're in charge of that. If you're the creator of it, then you're in charge of it. This is different at companies like Marvel, where I was just given a script to work on Ghost Rider, and I was only responsible for the pencils. So I just had to communicate with the writer and the inker and the colorist, and pretty much they kind of handled their own respective specialization. And I focused on just the pencils and the storytelling. But whereas if you're building your own IP, and especially these days if you're doing it like a webcomic or something like that, then you own everything. And that also means if viewers drop off, it's because you're not writing the most exciting story, or your art is failing, or some decision that you've made is the cause of it. Whereas when you're working in video games, more often than not, somebody else is really making those big decisions, unless if you're in a managerial or leadership role. This tripped me up a lot. Like I was coming out of basically being what I call a creator. I was a creator. I created my own worlds. I was responsible for the story and the art and delivering the final product to the consumer. Whereas when I went to work in games, it's like, wow, you just gotta, do what your boss tells you to do and shut up about anything else. And I am enjoying that kind of ownership again. I am enjoying that every pixel matters. In this way, comic books are very appealing. I mean, when we talk about, especially in America, where we talk about like the power, it's a powerful story to hear the story of like an underdog who created this thing. Like when we hear about the creator of Harry Potter, we hear about how she was like living in her car and she was like really broke and struggling. And then, she made it through. She broke through after all the rejection letters that she got from Harry Potter. It's like, hey, she was a big success. And like, we love that kind of a story. That seldom happens in video games anymore, but it can still happen with comic books. And why is that? Because video games require like $20 to $30 million to make a really competitive high-end AAA game. You still have the indie scene, but it's a really challenging thing because the expectations, the average gamer doesn't know the difference between a $50 million game and a $2,000 budget game for the development. They just see a game and they decide, well, do I want to play that game or do I not want to play that game? Well, this game looks better than that game, so I'm going to put my money towards the game that looks better. And usually the game that looks better is the one with the bigger budget. and the bigger team. Some video games are developed by teams that are literally 800 to 1,000 people. Assassin's Creed, for instance, is a game that's developed by something like 800 people. And what that means is that if you are in charge of texturing buildings, for instance, then that's your only job. You should not be concerned with the story or going to the director with any ideas for story. Whereas if you're a comic book creator, you're going to be in charge of everything. If you want a character to be a certain way or have this particular moment in the script, you can choose that, and you can have absolute control over that if you're totally indie. But the downside of that is that there's just no stability with it. Comic books are like bubblegum. Pretty much as soon as you've eaten it and chewed on it for a little while, it loses its flavor and okay, time for a new piece of gum. That's the consumer's view of comic books. It's like, I got one in the mail. Okay, now I'm ready for the next one. There are very few legendary comics that I think people really stand out. And a lot of times I think people buy comics for the idea of it more than they buy it for reading it. I'm generalizing here, and if you're an exception to those things, I do apologize. I know there are hardcore comic book readers, but in the indie comic space, it's like the creator is such a big integral part of the story of why somebody buys that indie comic. For me, I hear it all the time. It's like, oh man, Trent Kaniuga, he was the reason I got into comics because he was showing that a 16-year-old kid, just like me, could make comic books and make a living. And that was the story that they attached to when they wanted to buy Creed. So I don't even know if people would buy Creed now because I'm not a 16-year-old kid doing it anymore. That story doesn't sell that idea anymore. Now I just really have to write a kick-ass story. So going back to the responsibility factor, you're responsible for everything when it comes to a comic book, when it comes down to like how it's colored, when it comes down to the art direction, when it comes down to the writing, when it comes down to the art. If you're not the artist who's making it, then you have to be responsible for which artist you hire. The team you put together is entirely, your responsibility when you're releasing it, unless you're doing it as a partnership. Every line of dialogue is going to be your responsibility. And that can be daunting. That can be overwhelming to some people. It's a lot more work than you might realize, especially to make a very competitive comic book in today's market. Also, consumers are very demanding and they want them with great frequency, and they want large paperbacks. Like, they want large collections, like a complete story. 88-page story is a great way to start a series, but who can take the time to put together an 88-page story and put that out every few months? I think that consumers want them with a lot more frequency than we're willing to accept. Now, there will always be exceptions, and I'm sure that right now you're going, oh, what about this guy who made this big successful thing and he only does one big fat graphic novel a year? Well, he's an exception, and there's also a lot of other factors to consider, such as momentum and how successful of things they've made in the past. How much demand do they have on them? Oftentimes we mistake popularity with quality, when in reality, it's usually more to do with how we feel about that person and the consistency of the quality of the product they've delivered in the past. Things that I love about doing comic books, because I'm kind of getting back to doing it right now for this remaster, and it's really kind of a test to see how much I enjoy it, but there are some things that I really love about it. For one, every line that you draw goes into the book. That's right. Everything that you do, unless you decide to cut it, every single line, every scribble, every squiggle, every line of dialogue, every single sketch line, if you leave a pixel in there, it's going in the book. Whereas with video games, depending on how big the company is, I've worked on games where only 25% of what I've made got into the game. And that's after it went through the modeling process and somebody, several other artists worked on it that were beyond my control. It wasn't my vision anymore. And so it's nice to know that if I do this panel this certain way, it has meaning. If I sit down for an hour and I, sacrifice time with my family and friends or something, and if I go, hey, I can't go out tonight because I got to finish this page, that page is going to matter. That page is going to go into the book. Nobody can step in and cut my pages. Not on my book. I love hiring my own team. I love picking exactly the people that I'm working on this project with. And I love that if I'm reading through my book as it's progressing and I go, well, wait a minute, there's a missing scene here. I can go, hey, you know what? I'm going to just make sure that I add that page back in, or I'm going to add a new scene to clarify what's going on with the story here. I love that there's quantifiable progress. You can look at your pages and go, okay, I've roughed out the next scene, and here's the sketches of those pages, and I can post those because I own it. There's nothing secretive about it. With video games, oftentimes you're working on something that's very top secret. I can't tell you about new heroes that are going into the games that I'm working on because that's not my business. I would be breaching my contract. It's super secretive. But for my comic, I can show you any page that I'm working on. I can show you every pixel of progress that I'm making, and they matter. They mount up to equate to a larger body of work. That comes with another challenge as well, though, because there's making people aware of what it is that you're doing. The biggest drawback to doing comics is that you're going to work a lot harder for a longer period of time, and nobody will notice or care. And even if you've had a success 10 years ago, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to tune in to check out your new stuff. You have to bring the hype all the time. That means you've got to research marketing. You are an independent business when you're doing a comic book. You have to research marketing. You have to research your audience. You have to find out what they want from you. What do they expect from you? What are they looking for? And that is a constant challenge to always try to one-up your old self and always try to feed that audience, especially, if you yourself aren't reading the kind of books that you're making. Or if you're making something that's unlike any other book that's out there right now. You also have to make decisions about that big question of digital versus print. Are you going to build your own brand on your own website with a webcomic? Or are you going to go straight for the big publishers? Are you going to go straight to pitching your book to a publisher? Publishing deals in comic books are a nightmare. I can honestly say I've only had like one good publisher. In the 9 or 10 years that I did comic books, I only had like one good publisher, and it was a rare situation. Most comic book publishers will try to sneak in stuff or trick you or put in clauses so that they can make more money off of your book than you do, even though you're busting your ass trying to make the damn thing. Sometimes you sign a deal that locks up the rights to your comic for like 5 years, or sometimes you do a deal assuming that they're going to take care of publishing and lettering and taking care of editorial. I've never had an editor that gave me a note. In the 9 years that I worked in comic books, I never had an editor give me a note. They never asked me to change anything. There was a couple of editorial things. The letterer actually came back to me one time and said, hey, you spelled this word wrong. As an indie comic book artist, you're responsible for making your own deadlines. You're responsible for delivering to your customers. One of the more awesome aspects of making a comic is that you're essentially directing your own movie. Now, I always thought of it more as I was directing an animation or I was directing a movie. I'm choosing my camera angles. I'm choosing the type of shot that I want. I'm choosing the colors and the mood for that scene. And I'm trying to convey all of that emotion and the timing with the panels to deliver a moment to the viewer, to deliver a mood to the viewer. The most incredible thing that you can do when you're creating a story is to get an emotional reaction from your viewer. This is actually easier when you can draw pretty well because you're stimulating an emotion. People don't think that when they're looking at art, they're feeling something, but it's technically true. It's like if you don't feel anything, you don't even bother to look at it. And that's the point of art, is to make you feel something. Comic books are like storyboards for a film. And in fact, I mean, when you look at The Walking Dead, the TV show follows the panels almost beat for beat at times because they pretty much used it as storyboards to make the show. And if you can do that with your comic, well, there have been comic books that have been translated into a film that do it exactly that way. They just use the panels as a base for the storyboards for the film. So in a sense, you're creating this entire film, this entire universe, this entire story. Also, it means you have to be very concise because comic books also take a long time to produce. So in short, I love making comic books because it's like directing your own films. It's like making your own world. I stopped making comics for several years to go and work on some of the world's biggest video games. I don't get to own any of that stuff. I don't get to own any of it. Nobody knows or cares the things that I've designed, the locations I've designed in those games. I don't really get any ownership or sense of connection with people for the locations that I've designed. When you're playing Summoner's Rift, nobody thinks that, oh, that looks like a Trent Kaniuga painting, or anything like that. So this is really kind of like something that I do get to own, and I'm doing it pretty much, you know, from nuts to bolts, everything. If you'd like to read any of my previous Creed comics or any other comics I've done, you can pick up PDF versions of those over on my Gumroad channel. And of course that signs you up for the mailing list, but I'm going to really appreciate your support when I do my Indiegogo in January. Dudes, I've never done a crowdfunded thing before. I'm going to really need all the support that I can get. And so please do stay tuned. And I'm going to be doing a lot of comic book tutorial stuff here on my YouTube channel throughout December and January of this year. So I look forward to seeing you guys in those videos. If you have any questions, please drop those in the comments below. I look forward to hearing from you. And if there's something that you absolutely, a favorite moment that you have from my reading my previous books, please drop those in the comments below as well. And dudes, until next time, I'll catch you all mañana bond. That's every Wednesday and sometimes more. And until then, ciao, baby. Oh, yeah.